From the tallest crag of the Fanghorn Mountains, across the uncharted plains of the Forgotten Realms, to the deepest, darkest crypt or basement, you will find heroes and adventurers playing Dungeons and Dragons. Welcome to Absurdum, everyone, the podcast which takes any random topic and discusses it into absurdity. I am Dallas Kasabuski. With me is my fantastic co-host, Alex Adams.
Welcome, everybody.
And today we're going to be talking about Dungeons and Dragons, the interactive role-playing adventure game. Don't worry, I got more. Before we get underway, I want to first thank you, Alex, for joining me. Scheduling things from opposite sides of the Atlantic Ocean is not easy, and I'm happy we're able to make some time. Secondly, I want to thank you, our listeners and subscribers, for tuning in and showing us you care. Now, we had briefly discussed Dungeons & Dragons on our last podcast, which was all about hobbies. Seriously, check it out. Good stuff. And before I run out of breath, I just want to remind our listeners as to what Dungeons & Dragons is. Dungeons & Dragons is a fantasy tabletop role-playing game, which was first published in 1974, by the way. So we've been playing this game for a while. Basically, it involves a group of people sitting together and telling and acting out a story, usually told in a fantasy setting, with magic and combat rules built in for stability. Some of those people play the characters in the story, and one person, the dungeon or game master, referees the rules, plays the monsters and other characters, and drives the story forward. You've likely seen it portrayed in bad movies and on TV, such as The Big Bang Theory and Community. Today we're going to be talking about what it is, really, and why we think so many people like or dislike the game, and I'll probably include a couple of links below that can get you more information if you're interested. So, Alex, time for me to calm down and hand over the microphone. Tell us, why is this game so popular?
This game has captured the minds and hearts of basement-dwelling nerds everywhere, and I think, honestly, it has permeated into popular culture recently. Back in the day, it was relegated only to, and this was basically due to the lack of the internet and the lack of real, authentic communication between like cloistered groups of like pop culture nerds or people with very specific hobbies. Didn't really get a chance to communicate to one another. If you wanted to go learn about Dungeons and Dragons, you needed to go to the Dungeons and Dragons club in your local high school. We're talking 70s, 80s, ladies and gentlemen, or in university. You couldn't really get exposed to it outside of how it was portrayed in popular culture, which was usually a bunch of freaks in hoods with like glued on pointy ears, rolling dice and talking about something. And there was like little figurines everywhere. And then sometimes it would just jump cut into like a fantasy vignette where you would see actual people fighting actual dragons in actual dungeons. And with the advent of video games, a lot of people don't realize that many of the fantasy video games, I think we can say that the main progenitor of the idea of Dungeons and Dragons was probably some of these fantasy writers, Tolkien, the writer of Conan, whose name continually escapes me. But that kind of idea, that fantasy world where people who were, you didn't even have to be socially marginalized. Anyone who found tremendous interest in these fantasy worlds would want to live that. They would want to create that. And Dungeons and Dragons offered this perfect platform for people to live out these fantasies, to experience the pathos and the riveting thrill of adventure with their friends. And doing anything with friends always magnifies the human experience. It magnifies your emotion. And the reason, bringing it back, why it's become so fascinating is because it's the perfect intersection between something that's intensely personal, or can be intensely personal, and something that is shared. Because when people bring their own, it's, and I'm sure you agree with me, and many people listening now will agree with me. It's such a great, for those of you who've played, it's such a great way to express yourself creatively and bring creative stuff to the public. There's no real way to there's how do I put this? Everything's sort of set up for you to express yourself. If you want to write something, if you want to paint something, if you want to perform in some way, there's a lot of sort of internal blockages and walls to get over. Like, you have a blank page. Okay, what do I do? I'm just gonna start writing a play, I guess, or I'm just gonna perform, or I'm gonna make a dance, I'm gonna learn an instrument, make a song. With Dungeons and Dragons, I'm not saying that there's like a complete equality there, but you've got this structure set up where it's like, okay, you and all your friends are in a green verdant field. This would be like the dungeon master talking, and you see, an old craggly mansion that's ruinous and covered in vines. And what do? And you have this ground bed, this bedrock of creative action that you can express yourself in a way, and with all your friends. Excuse me. If you and all your friends, if you have a bunch of cool, interesting, funny people around you that can express themselves and play off one another and improvise, and you're doing this at a bar, you're doing this at, in class or detention hall, and you have this ground bed of creative action and interesting, fun stuff that your friend is writing about and creative, and you're all creating together, that creates this incredible feeling of this combined, co-created storyline that you all can be participant of. So as time went on, this has become this phenomenon. I think I'm not too bold to call it a phenomenon. It's certainly international, and this is something that people are having incredible amounts of fun with. And if you haven't tried it, you should try it too.
Well, that's a pretty good encompassing viewpoint of it. I should have mentioned in the intro that it's even made bigger headlines in the last year with its inclusion in the show Stranger Things.
Oh, yeah. Can we talk about Stranger Things for a second? Not to date it?
Let's make sure we can dance around spoilers if possible.
Oh, yeah. Okay.
If you want. If we don't, we can post a spoiler warning. But I will say spoiler-free that I'm really I'm appreciative of how they in the show Stranger Things, which is obviously about something abnormal based on the title. the writers of the show did an excellent job of using Dungeons and Dragons as not only a tool to kind of make you feel nostalgic for the time that the show was based in.
It was the mid-'80s, by the way.
Yeah, but they also used Dungeons & Dragons as a storytelling device to kind of mirror what was happening in the show. You start off with a bunch of kids playing a game, and the game they're playing is silly, but they're fighting monsters and stuff, and then strange things start to happen in the town. And I think that was really cool, not only to, get Dungeons & Dragons into the forefront, but an interesting storytelling device.
Yeah. I always find this funny because it's sort of like a passing thought that always recurs whenever I see these sort of like fantasy worlds. For those of you who have ever gotten this feeling that there seems to be some sort of this like intertextual language of monsters and mechanics. And a lot of times, I don't want to go there, but sort of like the jock type or whoever, right? Anyone who's not really into this stuff, I'm using heavy air quotes right now, will see a bunch of different stories or books or episodic television series, and they'll see these monsters, and these monsters seem to appear in toto, fully formed, looking the same way, doing the same things in different stories, like drakes, hippogriffs, satyrs. And a lot of times I would be like back in the day, there was this show called Reboot, which was a great show. It's like the CGI show. And there was another Dungeons and Dragons episode, homage show. And all the characters, like the thief, the wizard, the barbarian, necromancers, where does all this stuff come from? And the answer is usually Dungeons and Dragons, because so many different creative types will draw from the rich tapestry of monsters and creatures. The Beholder, what is that? This big creature with a big face and a bunch of eyes on tentacles flying around shooting laser beams at everyone? What the hell is that? And why am I seeing that in 5 different shows that have nothing to do with one another? Fully formed. And the reason I say that... so just to bring it back, the Demogorgon, which in the first episode, all the characters are all young kids, and they're all playing Dungeons and Dragons in the very first episode of Stranger Things. They talk about this creature called the Demogorgon, which is a storytelling device, which I won't get into later. But our mutual friend Mike was like, "Oh yeah, I've got that miniature," and the Demogorgon's this actual Dungeons and Dragons creature, which I was like, "Wow." That's how many years have I been playing? I never encountered a Demogorgon yet.
Yeah. So backing it up a little bit, I think you hit some points right on the head. I mean, first off, we said that Dungeons and Dragons was made in the late 70s. It's important to remember that the root of Dungeons and Dragons was the origins of it was already kind of exclusive and not well known, because what it was a bunch of people who basically at a university, they had like a couple of friends in like a model building, like a war. They had two groups of friends. One was in one was in war games, and one was in kind of like model planes and model like ships and stuff. And they would come together and they would make, they would start playing, and they started making rules for the war games, because at first it was just like, oh look, this is how this actual battle happened. They'd push like a little plane along the board, and they'd push some cavalry and be like, this is how this happened. And one of them was like, hey, let's make this, like, let's do this, but with fantasy characters. So right at the beginning for Dungeons and Dragons, it was a war game mixed with fantasy, because they wanted to try and bring something completely different to life. They had been acting out like real historical battles. Now, oh my god, what if there was a dragon there? So that right there shows a little bit of the kind of the origin, but also maybe why people initially may be off-put by Dungeons and Dragons, because it does, even if you move past all of the the bespectacled dungeon living larger men who don't know how to socialize, are playing this game. Even when you move past those images, it's often Dungeons and Dragons itself is based in a world of fantasy, and some people may not like that. I don't know anyone like that, but I know that there's some who may just not really care for fantasy because it's too unreal. But It's important to remember that Dungeons and Dragons itself has spawned so many other versions of the same game. You now have pretty much any kind of setting you can think of.
Yep.
There is a game like Dungeons and Dragons that involves storytelling and some rules to meter out combat. You've got Western, you've got sci-fi, you've got like steampunk, political thriller. Pretty much any kind of story or situation, someone can make rules and craft a system around it. So,
and with any level of that, what you said, that unreality, because if you want to play, and a perfect example would be George R.R. Martin's Game of Thrones series, which is very, very steeped in human interaction and intrigue and courtly struggles. So if you wanted to play it out like that and have a really the term for those of you who are unaware is quote unquote low magic, a low magic world where there's not a lot of wizard beard stroking wizards flying through space and the 70s aesthetic suns and moons and all that kind of crazy stuff. Or if you want to play a bunch of werewolves in a modern day New York sort of gothic area rife with sexual tension, you can play that too. There's so many elements involved. I do want to mention that one of the original things that really put me off, which didn't want to get me involved in Dungeons and Dragons, and I mentioned this in the last podcast, so I won't belabor the point, but the fact that there was this aspect of imaginative sort of effluvial, groundless element to the game. And what I mean is you have this battle grid. For those of you envisioning this right now, modern Dungeons & Dragons is played with the Dungeon Master behind this sort of 3-paneled sheet, and he has all the information about the story, and then as player characters you have your character sheet more often than not, which has the stats of your health and how much damage you can take before you die, your skills and abilities, and what you're sort of good at. Some person could be good at climbing, another person would be sort of a quick talker, like the face of the group can be very charismatic, some guy could be very strong, could bust down a door. And then you've got the grid with your little figurines, but and this is particularly prevalent to people who have sort of been weaned on video games, which are highly visual. I'm like, well, where's the story happening? What is actually happening? And it's happening in everybody's mind because we use visual language and descriptors and terms to describe what's going on in the story, and it didn't really click for me until I realized that it was less of a video game and more of a story. It's not it's if for those of you who've really been engrossed in a fantasy story, you're capable of like having that, like Harry Potter comes to mind, for instance. Like, you have those images of those characters in your mind based on words alone, and this is the sort of in the same way.
Yeah, and that's very true. I mean, if you're looking for like there are board games or even Dungeons and Dragons board games that combine the elements, but at its root, Dungeons and Dragons is a game that only requires cooperation, imagination, and maybe some pen and paper in case you actually need to write stuff down. But yeah, you can go from a variety of visual representation. I mean, you can play an entire game of Dungeons and Dragons just by speaking.
Oh yeah.
Or you could have a battle grid, as you say, to kind of geolocate yourself based on other creatures and characters. You can have dungeon masters, like a couple of friends of ours, who have props, and they have like little models, scale models of like castles and caves and mountains, and you have your little figurine moving around. And sometimes you can even do a digital version where you can move your character throughout a digital world or map, and it's in that way it's more resembling a video game, but still, we've been dancing around it, but still at the heart, Dungeons and Dragons is a story that you interact with. So this is why whenever someone tells me that they don't know what it is, or they don't think that they'd like it, it's like, well, if you can get yourself involved in a story or in a world that sounds interesting. I mean, if you're not into fantasy, but you're into science fiction, great. Find a game that's running some kind of science fiction thing. Make a character that you want. And that character, a lot of people when they play, they don't understand this because not everybody took drama in school, and not everybody, it's like, well, I don't know what kind of character to make. Well, you can be yourself. You could literally just play yourself. Maybe yourself who has also been trained how to fire a weapon or wield a sword or throw magic, depending on the game.
Or a little more confident than you are.
Yeah, exactly. You can play any kind of character you want, and we're going to get into that in a moment, but that's some of the advantages here, is that you can, Dungeons & Dragons basically lets you do whatever you want, as long as it's agreed upon by the group and kind of satisfies the rules of the world that your dungeon or game master has made. So before we get into that, Alex,
yes.
First, you mentioned your hesitation in the beginning. What kind of, what was your first game, and what kind of a world was it, and what did you think after playing, if you can remember that well?
I remember it vividly.
Moons ago.
I remember it vividly. The first game was actually run by a mutual friend of mine, Mike, and he invited me over to play in one of his campaigns. He's sort of like a career dungeon master against his will because he's so good at it. So he invited me in, and I was always curious about how the mechanics were run and how this world, because I've just seen it in a million different shows and series and movies and websites. I'm like, I gotta check this out. So I played this cleric, which is, for those of you unfamiliar, it's sort of like an armored holy warrior. And what were we doing? I remember this, like, it was just sort of a very crazy game because there was like gods walking around and like this gigantic sort of gladiatorial arena. And at some point I pledged my soul to like an evil god and like cut my hand off. And then like the god that I actually served came back, and then I cut my arm off. And this belied my understanding of like video game logic. And you'll find like every dungeon master has their own logic, but I'm like, oh yeah, if I cut one arm off, I'll just be strong enough, in the other arm. And I'm reminded of like, all the famous one-armed popular culture badasses like Oro from Street Fighter 3, Future Gohan from the Future Trunks Android saga in Dragon Ball Z. All these people with one arm that could just like totally kick ass. I'm like, yeah, I'll just have one arm. And Mike was like, no. You have one arm. No, you're. If you're trying to climb a ladder, it's going to be harder. No, you can't hold a shield and a sword in the same arm. Sorry. So I'm like, whoa. So at the same time, I'm like, okay, this is. But then what happened was, he understood that, like, okay, well, this is obviously like he had this idea of what he wanted to be as a hero. He wanted to be this like wounded hero. So Mike later, a couple later sessions, was like, yeah, you can pay a lot of money to get like an enchanted star metal arm, which was like this like, you know, android arm. And I thought that was the coolest thing in the world, to be this paladin with one arm, but having another arm like for instance, Ash from Evil Dead, not Evil Dead? No, Army of Darkness, who had the metal arm that could crush a can and go groovy. And all the other cool one-armed robot arm characters in my life. I think Cable actually has a robot arm too from Cable and Deadpool. So anyway, and I say all these name drops for a very specific reason. There was this moment where we were riding on this airship and a dragon crashed into it, and I was flung off, plummeting at terminal velocity over this town, and the dragon was flying by too. And I was passing a bunch of houses, and Mike's like, well, how do you want to play this, Alex? And I said, well, you know, I'm just going to kind of like, you know, crumple into a ball and hope for the best and hope the impact doesn't, you know, sort of kill me. And Mike was like, no. You could do so much cooler than that. Think about what's on your body right now. Think about the arm you've got. I'm like, okay. I'm going to punch my arm through one of the roofs and sort of grind down the tiles and slow my velocity through punching through all of these bricks. And he's like, yeah, that's super, super cool. And in that whole, like, I think it must have only been like 3 hours total over these few sessions, I understood that, like, I could bring to the table all the cool stuff that I've seen in different movies and television shows, and all the cool warriors and interesting figures and the cool moments that I've seen in the different movies that I've watched. And I could bring that to the table in a way that is new and exciting and is uniquely my own, that I could sort of blend these things together, which was totally creative and totally rewarding, because I had another person, even though this was underpinned by a set of rules like gravity and you know, health points and things like that, there's still there was the result was this other guy that was sort of rooting for me to be cool, and that was such a excellent first impression that I just knew I had to come back. And as there were different, I've been in a lot of different campaigns with varying levels of coolness and enjoyability, but I've always come out with the fact that, like, wow, this is a cool way for me to have a creative outlet and spend time with my friends. And that's what's been keeping me back all these years.
Nice. Yeah, I remember that game. I don't think, see, my involvement with Dungeons and Dragons at first was limited. Because, you know, you and I met and I knew, you know, Mike was my roommate, and he was running these games, but I was, when you guys started playing, I was just too busy. Like, I just couldn't get myself away from my work. But often what would happen is, you know, these sessions that you play are a couple hours long. So when you start, I'm unavailable. And halfway through, I could take a break. So I would go to where you guys were, and I'd kind of just sit in and watch. And I would often kind of say things like, you know, characters like, oh, I'm stuck in this trap, I can't get out. And I'd be like, don't you have rope? Like, oh yeah, I do. Or they'd be doing something, and I'd lean over to Mike and be like, but he said he didn't have any, like, he said he dropped the key in the last room or whatever. And so I kind of like was this weird voice that would like whisper help and discouragement to both sides of the table for a while. But since then I've played a lot, lots of different games, staying within the Dungeons and Dragons kind of fantasy realm, not really going too far outside of that. Did you end up? Yeah, you ended up playing the one that Mike ran, the zombie survival one.
I ran that one too. Yeah, that was a modern day one. To speak to that a little bit, the caveat here is I'm not a huge, like, everyone has a personal preference. I love the crazier the fantasy setting, the better. So for modern day, not really my bag, but I still had a blast. And what was really interesting about this campaign was actually set, we at the time we were all living in Toronto, it was set in our city. and it was set in modern day, and we had to pick the classes we had to pick were actual career classes. So I picked a judge, and I think somebody else was a police officer, and somebody else was like an RN, maybe like a bouncer. I think there was somebody in there, and that they were all reflective of the fantasy archetypes. So we had sort of this weird mishmash of like modern day career people, which with also like some fantasy powers. And I think there was this like worlds collide kind of thing where this other fantasy world was permeating into our world, which has actually been done by a variety of other game creators. Like actual tabletop games have sort of followed suit with that. But that was a blast too, because we were able to like go through our own city streets and be like, oh yeah, the intersection between this and this. Oh yeah, there's like a martial arts depot there. We can get some like knives and guns and stuff. Oh yeah, let's do that. So that was also such a blast.
Yeah, I mean, I'm just thinking about some of the games that I've played, and I've gotten so much out of it. I mean, obviously, as you said, it's an excellent venue for spending time with friends. Next weekend, actually, I'm spending 4 or 5 hours with some friends playing D&D, and we're just continuing a story that we've been playing for a while. So that's amazing. I live overseas in France. All my friends are back in Canada, so it's nice that we can still maintain this. This hobby, even when we're so far apart. So I'm going to get into some of the. We talked about what it is. You can look it up. While we've gone on about how the structure is, I want to talk a little bit about what I've gotten out of it, because I think Dungeons and Dragons is a game that if you put more into it, you can get more out of it. You read a book. Maybe a typical fantasy book, you get to the end, you're like, well, that was really interesting. Cool. Or maybe you really put a lot of thought into it and you're like, oh, I can't believe the characters did that. Or you start to question, like, oh, would I have done the same thing?
Maybe write some fan fiction.
If I was Ned Stark in Game of Thrones, would I have told Queen Cersei what I was planning to do before I did it, which then caused this and this and this to happen? I don't know. So that's the first thing that I would say I love about Dungeons and Dragons. I mean, I sound like such an misanthrope here, but after the social aspect of it, it's the ability to make or consider choices that you would never actually have to make or consider in real life.
Yes.
I kind of feel like it's like flexing my moral muscle, my morality muscle, because in the real world, I really hope I will never have to worry about monsters. I'll never have to worry about defending myself, hopefully against physical attack. I'll never have to worry about should I give the monster mercy or should I finish him off here so he's no longer a threat. But in a setting like this, you're more open to being able to do that. And even when you're playing a character who's not like you can go in and say, you know what, like, I try to be a really nice person in real life. It's exhausting. I'm going to go into Dungeons and Dragons and be a dick. I'm going to be horrible. And you can do this. And as long as it kind of works in your party with your friends or, the people you're playing with, then that's fine. You can be like an aristocratic snob. But you're still going to have to run into these choices, into these moments. And maybe your aristocratic snob is like, nah, I don't care about the homeless. Like, move along. Mm-hmm. But even when you're making this choice as that character, you're still thinking about like, well, I would not abandon this person in real life, and it's kind of like a introspective part where you can kind of say like, how would I react here? And I think that's really neat because it's not something that nobody advertises that. I mean, it probably would scare a bunch of people away. They'd be like, what? I just want to play a game. I don't want to make choices. But then you look at some video games that sell themselves on the ability to make choices. When Mass Effect came out, it was like, it's your game. You can be whatever kind of person you want to be, and you can make whatever kind of choices you want. And a lot of people were drawn to that game for that reason. So yeah. That's one thing that I get out of it. How about you, Alex? What kind of unexpected thing do you kind of get out of it? You mentioned about being able to bring some some creativity and ideas from pop culture and media.
Yeah, that's definitely a huge pull for me. Ooh, I would have to say I love relating to people. I love communicating with people, and I love sort of, so for me, I can say that one thing that I've loved after a while, and I want to build on what you said about how people will get a chance to do and experience and choose things that they might not do or choose or experience in their regular life. And I see this as sort of this a persistent sort of parabola is a curve, right?
Yeah. It's
sort of
one
like
half of a curve. Yeah.
a curve of growth where beginning players will sort of say, and you see this in a video game too, in open world video games like GTA or Prototype or Infamous, where they're like, oh, I can do anything. Oh, well, I'm gonna punch this guy in the face. I'm gonna steal this car. I'm gonna stab this guy and bust down this door. And that's sort of, you get your fill on being, and there's a term in the quote unquote industry called being sort of a murder hobo. Where and the reason why hobo is because sometimes you'll have a tavern, like people will go to rest. If you've read, ladies and gentlemen, if you've read Lord of the Rings, and the whole, in Fellowship of the Ring, they go to Bree and they go to the tavern, they sleep and they rest. Taverns sort of have this element of rest to them, but you have to pay for a bed, just like in the real world. But initial players will be like, well, I don't want to pay for a bed. I've only got 10 gold coins. I'll just sleep on the road. And then I'll wake up and I'll kill a bunch of people and take their gold. And so that's that's really where that comes from. But in the same way as your character is sort of like a musical instrument that you learn to play better and better each time, what I've really gotten from from D&D is having these creating a character with quote unquote edges. What I mean by that is, like, if I have a character, like for instance, Dallas, you mentioned like a rich fop kind of archetype. So somebody who's like fastidious and a little bit cruel and egoistic and doesn't really care about anything but money and status, and is fawning over the people above him and dismissive over the people below him in the rank of social order. And contrast that guy with a total brute, raised in a barn, poops in the woods, giant battle axe, doesn't wear a shirt, drinks all the time, farts, burps, all kinds of liquids and gases coming out of him, just can't read or write, leaves the door open. Like, it's the perfect odd couple, and not necessarily, I've sort of, my joy has sort of shifted, it's been a paradigm shift away from the stuff I can do and sort of into this in-between Venn diagram of the results of multiple characters interacting. You got that amazing scene, that little slice of life scene in Lord of the Rings with Gimli and Legolas, where Legolas can drink Gimli under the table because he's an elf and the alcohol just doesn't affect him. And Gimli is this total, beer-swilling dwarf, and he thinks he can drink anybody under the table, and he just gets completely plastered and falls drunk, and Legolas is like, oh, I'm an elf. Like, those ideas, those interactions, and I've had millions of them. I was in a campaign where I was this sort of, like, really erudite and bizarre monk-like character who had this, like, you could maybe relate it to, like, Iron Fist or some of these other monks where they don't really understand, or like Thor from Marvel Avengers, where sort of from a different world, doesn't really relate. And that scene in the Avengers where he's drinking the coffee and he's like, another, smashes it on the floor. Like, those weird interactions between characters who are completely different, I just relish that inside and outside of combat. All those interactions, comedic or otherwise, really, really gets my goat. And that's what I really get from Dungeons and Dragons.
Yeah, well, that's the thing. Like, it's very reminiscent of a play or a story that you're telling. So those kinds of interactions really, they really bring it out. I mean, you can have a movie or a video game or a book where the characters go from one place to another, defeating the enemy, and then they go home. And there are a lot of movies that are really great that way, and it's just like, barely any dialogue, and it's just all action. But then you can have other ones where they don't have any kind of, crazy climactic action at all, but there's so much, so many emotions flowing around, so much drama and intrigue. And then you can have a mixture of both. Yeah, you can have exactly. I mean, imagine I mean, let's say I was playing the bureaucrat, you were playing the brute, and the story was that I don't know, I was at like some kind of royal function, and the royal family had like been kidnapped or killed or something, and all of a
Mm-hmm.
sudden I was blamed. So I got the heck out of there because I didn't do it at all.
Mm-hmm.
And you happened to be like the guy like working out back, like unloading the cargo to cater the luncheon or whatever.
Mm-hmm.
And now the two of us are trying to prove our innocence in this whole situation. And like I'm using the few political connections I have left while still staying under the radar. And you like have a link to the criminal underground. You're not a criminal, but you just because you're the way you are, everybody kind of you. People try to hire you for jobs like this,
Mm-hmm.
and you have this like really great opportunity. I mean, I remember I listened. I wasn't even there, and you and a friend of ours, Patrick, you ended up playing a game where you were both cops, but he was the like I do everything by the book, and every I do everything by the book, and that book I do by another book, and like everything is like in this perfect order, and everything is this way, and you were like kind of like a hippie cop. You're like, yeah, whatever, man. Like, you just gotta go with the flow. Like, and it was some of the most hilarious stuff that I've heard in a long time. Because you're right, it's personality clashes that can really bring out some interesting moments in the game.
Absolutely. That's I wanted to mention briefly about how everyone can sort of bring their own stuff to the table, bring their own like expressions to the table. If you are rather, so this allows people to be really really creative, but creative in their own ways. We have a mutual friend, who is really good at drawing, and he can actually draw portraits of the characters and the player characters, which are player characters being the characters that your friends are playing, and non-player characters, that being everybody else. So like, let's say a king that everybody knows, but it's not actually being voiced by any of the people around the table, but the dungeon master sort of steps in and is like, well, I'll play the king for this moment that you're talking to him. And that brings so much so much perspective, and like really, at least for me, draws us all into the world of the story, because you get to see like in detail, because he draws actually good, not like me who draws like stick figures and like Pac-Man. But and that's like really fascinating. And then, for instance, another person like our friend Mike is really really good at making worlds, making civilizations and cultures that are unique and sort of interact in different ways. So that's the kind of thing where like the whole world has all these facets to it, and he's really good at anytime you're like, well, what's like there's all these like pots on the wall. Well, what's this thing? This is a weird thing. And Mike could be like, well, that symbol relates to this culture, and it actually comes from this. And I would say that I would put myself in like sounds and voices. So instead of really, describing things visually, I can put on like a funny voice. Like for instance, that cop. That cop drama, which was actually set in like medieval fantasy, but we were like magic cops. I could put in like a Valley Surfer dude voice, man, and not really, get and like just sort of nail a character like that, like a character, like nail like an archetype really quickly, or like cool sound effects and using sound to sort of build that world. And that's I love that when everybody comes to the table. It's kind of like jamming, like if everyone with musicians, like people read stuff and absorb stuff, and it doesn't even have to be fantasy stuff. Like I've used historical stuff and like any kind of like comparative religion texts and cool myths that I've read, and like a little phrase from a book, from like an old Aesop's Fables or whatever, will be like, oh wow, that's cool, I'm gonna like take that and use it in the world that we're interacting with. And other people will do that too, so everyone's sort of bringing their lives and their creative forces to the table for like a mutual jam session. And I think that's super cool. When it goes really well, it goes really really well.
Definitely. And I have to point this out because there's a chance he may listen to the podcast. But if you want to talk about world building, I know we're just bragging here about our friends, but our friend Dominic is almost to an insane level of world building. Because Mike generally will say something like, oh, that pot has a symbol that is it's related to the King's Guard, and then you investigate the King's Guard, and you're drawn into this crazy story or whatever. Whereas Dom, Dom will be like, hold on one second, and he'll pull up like a physical book that he has made,
that he's wrote,
or written on the computer, and he's like, that specific pot was forged like 3 years ago in the King's blacksmith's like tavern or forge, and like he's got like the history of every like pebble of dust, and it's insane because that's what he likes to do. He likes to craft the world and
histories.
The histories of it, and it's insane. But you don't need that amount of preparation. Dungeons & Dragons is a very flexible game. You can come in with that much preparation, or you can come in with none at all. I'm currently watching, well, not at the moment, but when we're done with this call, I'm watching this Dungeons & Dragons game right now, and it's three experienced players and one new guy. He kind of knows, like, maybe he's listened to a video like this, and he's kind of like, I kind of understand how it works. And it's really fun to watch him, like, try to figure out what the game is, how it works, and what he can do. And he keeps running into these situations where he's like, I don't know, can I do that? And the players are like, ask the dungeon master. And generally, like you said, the dungeon master tries to facilitate the rules, but also the story. So if something is valid enough to be considered, and it's interesting enough to make a good exposition or a good part of the story, then you can at least attempt it. And that's where the dice come in. You roll the dice, you see if you succeed. But yeah, there's the jamming aspect that you mentioned is a great one, when someone like has an idea and then another person adds to it and then more, and all of a sudden you've got this like group dynamic going. In terms of drawing, I mentioned this in our last session that Dungeons and Dragons has helped me to express myself in new ways that I've often kind of mentally roadblocked myself. So drawing, for example, I rarely draw. A lot of my friends have a lot of visual artistry talent, and I just don't. And so, let me back up a second. In one game that I did, I wanted to write more, but I have this mental issue where I don't really like to write fiction. I love reading fiction, but I don't usually like to write it. But I decided, well, this character in this game is going to keep a journal. That's how he kind of like makes sense of the world. So I kept an actual journal written in this character's voice, in his perspective. And since then, I mean, I journaled the entire campaign, and I'm actually working on a physical book based on these journals and like stories I've written afterward. And in another campaign we're doing, I'm starting to draw. I'm playing a wizard, and in Dungeons and Dragons, a wizard often has a book of spells where they can consult and refer to the ancient mysteries. And I'm actually physically making this book, and it's helping me to understand my character. And it's helping me to actually draw, put pencil to paper, and actually create something. So, yeah, that was really cool. That like this game kind of, like you said, it's personal, but since it's forcing you to share it, which really brings these things out of yourself.
Absolutely, that's one of the best. I mean, I feel like there's a lot of events that have conspired in my life that facilitated me to become a more charismatic, outgoing person. But I really think Dungeons & Dragons was a salient feature of that part of my growth as a person, for the nature that it's interactional. And I think that goes against a lot of the stigma, which I really think is sort of like old news as of now. Like, there's actually a really funny movie, which I highly recommend anyone who actually plays D&D check this movie out. It's called Zero Charisma. Zero Charisma. It's basically about, and it's sort of like a dark comedy. It's like Taxi Driver with dice, with Dungeons and Dragons. It's super good. The guy who stars in it also directs it, so it's really sort of like a passion project. But it's one of those stories where like his world starts to fall apart because he's like an uber nerd D&D dungeon master. but then one of his players of a long-time campaign leaves, and he brings in another guy, and the new guy's sort of like the hipster archetype of like the new version of nerd who like just watched, he just watched Avengers, and like he's like, thin and trim and like dressed as hip, and like doesn't really know about this nerd stuff, but like he watched Games of Thrones with his girlfriend and wants to go into it. So like in any case, like that's sort of like an interesting dynamic, but it suggests that there's this whole new generation of people that you don't. And the point is being proven that you don't have to spend 800 hours reading all this lore and like drawing up handcrafted pencil maps and sort of like being withdrawn from, you can have a girlfriend and play Dungeons and Dragons. That's the case. Many of the people I know have wives now, and wives and kids. But the fact that I forget what my point was.
Well, let me jump in on that. So you're right. You don't need a lot of these. There are a lot of books and references and resources that you can use. And since we've talked about it so much, I'm going to talk about those in a minute. But you don't need them, and you also don't need to be. I think the point you were trying to get to is you don't need to be this like. That you don't need to fit into the stereotype of knowing every single thing about every kind of nerd thing in order to join. If you have ideas, if you have a will to want to do this, then the game can move forward. So that's another thing. We're going to come back to what you need to play in a moment, just in case you're really interested now. But this is an interesting thing about Dungeons and Dragons that I think I kind of wish that it would spill out into other games or other social interactions, and that is, I don't know how to succinctly put it, but it's the understanding and compromise between players. Yes. So the way the structure works is you have this game, this dungeon master. This person, he or she, has a story or that they want to tell, or maybe they bought a pre-made adventure that they want to deliver. Fine. You have players who are representing the characters in the story. And each player has their own motivations for why they're sitting at that table playing. They have motivations for how they made their character and what kind of character they want to play. Happy, sad, mean, violent, peaceful, whatever. And because some people put a lot of detail and attention into understanding what kind of person their character is. Like my character was from a small village and has lost his mother at an early age, so he has a lot of faith in the gods and he prays every day. And all of a sudden, marauders came through and sent my townspeople away, and I lived on my own. And this is why my character now is coming to the table as a very righteous, but still very aggressive person. Yeah. And they want to play this character in this way, but you have to cooperate with the people at the table because, well, first off, it is a game. It is supposed to be an enjoyable experience. Yeah. And you're supposed to. You can argue with people and you can go back and forth, but at the end of the day, you're still supposed to work with the players at the table as well as the dungeon master. We keep splitting them into these two pools, dungeon master and players, but you're all really on the same team. Usually the dungeon master is there to help you through the story. So that's why Mike told you, like, hey, you could crumple up into a ball and see if you survive, but I'm giving you a chance to try and do something more memorable, more interesting, maybe a little bit more in tune with your character. So he helped foster this creativity from you, and he also probably helped you, like, statistically be able to do that, because there's no rule in Dungeons and Dragons that says, well, if your character is falling from an airship and is about to die, if there's a nearby building or infrastructure around that can be permeated by a metal arm, and you happen to have it, like, there's no rule that's that complex. But the Dungeon Master will work with you to say, well, what do you want to do? Okay, let's see how you could do that based on the rules that we have. There are no rules for that. It's similar to these. Okay. And then they're not just there to make you cool. They're not like, yeah, like it's not just a game where everybody's like, I'm super awesome. Yeah, me too. Great. 5 hours later. It's, you want to try that? Okay. Why? Oh, that does make sense for your character and for the story. Okay. Let's try it. Let's see. It's going to be tough because what you're doing is crazy.
There's risk reward involved. There's statistics and risk and reward.
And that back and forth, that understanding between player, character, player and the rest of the party, player and dungeon master, it's really important. And it's not always something that's explicitly focused on. Like the closest you ever get to explicitly telling players that you should be like this is there's a kind of an unwritten rule in the game called never split the party. Which means if one of your players or several want to go one way and the others want to go another way, do not both go in opposite directions because you are weaker when you are fewer, and the dungeon master will take advantage of this because their job is to not only tell the story but to reward and provide consequences for your actions, which makes the game more interesting and draws you in. So that understanding is crucial. I mean, if you want to play the angry, vengeful character, fine. But if you have a player at your party who wants to play kind of a naive, very optimistic person, you can't just insult them the whole time. But you can kind of rub the edges of your personality together. Maybe the optimist is like, let's go ask him for advice. And your character's like, I don't have time for this. And that person probably doesn't even know where to go. Yeah. So you go up and the person's like, hi, excuse me, could you tell me where is the Temple of Melora? And you're I don't know. And that's what makes it fun. So I really like that, and I kind of wish it would spill out into other games. You're sometimes playing a video game and people what the internet's like, people, it can be full of trolls and not fun ones that live under bridges that you have to answer a riddle for.
Ones that are very, very racist.
It can be very, very bad, and I think that this level of consideration and cooperation is an amazing side effect of the structure of Dungeons and Dragons. And not every experience is going to be a great one. You might team up with a bunch of strangers, and you don't all agree on how the game should be played, and it doesn't make for a great experience. But if you end up finding a group of people, friends or otherwise, who agree with kind of the direction you want to take, then it can be a very rewarding experience for all the reasons that we've said here.
Absolutely. I think I just wanted to speak to 2 points about that with in a group. So your characters are usually vastly different. Sometimes you're different races, and we're not talking human races. We're talking there could be a dragon creature, there could be a gnome, there could be a dwarf, there could be an elf, or some sort of sentient skeleton creature, robots, whatever area you're playing in. This is sort of like a mechanics question, but you always want to be asking yourself, or initially you want to ask yourself, why are we working together? And have an answer for that, because that's the core element of this team adventure group dynamic is you're all these different people, but you're working together. So why? So instead of sort of having that, having character frictions sort of fly off the rails and be like, well, I'm just going to start fighting this guy, and we're appealing to different divinities, so I'm just going to fight you. You want to ask yourselves why you're why are we working together? And as well, if any of you have ever played a beat 'em up or a team fighting game where you're going room to room and fighting all the guys, you ever notice how when one of the party goes to a door, that person won't go through the door until everybody else goes up to the door, and then you all go through the door as a group into a next room. Or for instance, there might be little arrows pointing hey, look, we're about to go through this door. That's kind of the same shtick you want to have with a Dungeons and Dragons party, where we're all you're all, or if one person goes to one edge of the screen and another person goes to the other edge of the screen, that screen ain't moving. You two are just bumping up against the edge of the screen, and unless the whole party goes in the same direction, then the screen starts to scroll and you get new experiences, new enemies. Keep that in mind, beginning players, because that's I've seen a lot of full party wipes where everyone dies and the game's over when that happens.
Yeah, and that's very true. I mean, we've been playing this game for quite a long time, so we're very familiar with a lot of obviously the rules and the lore and the different monsters, but we're also aware of these kinds of typical experiences of a player. As you said, a lot of first-time players, they either waddle in indecision because it's new and they're not sure what to do, or they play murder hobos because, if you can do whatever you want, your first instinct is just go crazy. Sometimes when people, they don't understand the party dynamic. And you're right. The first aspect is the fact that you are supposed to be working together because it's dangerous out there in the fantasy world. So why are you working together? Take, for example, a game that you and I play, which I hope we play again soon, but we'll see. Yeah. We play a game called The Long Game, which takes place over an entire world continent of all these different nations and politics and monsters and dragons and lots of crazy stuff. And the three characters that had been running together for the longest time, I mean, they couldn't be more different. My character was very much the child of, if you took Worf from Star Trek The Next Generation, Deep Space Nine, and you took Thor from the Avengers and kind of made him into a dragon man.
Named War.
Yeah.
Combination.
Thorf or something.
That's better. That's better.
So that was my character. He was this righteous, lawful good, doing, do-gooder, but he was very stern and battle hardened. And then, we had Mike's character, who was very, very much like a rogue,
scathing
in terms of his personality, sneaky, gotta do what you gotta do to get things done.
Yep.
Still a good guy, but not someone you'd want to meet because he was, always behind the scenes trying to make things happen for the greater good. Yeah. And then you have your character. You can explain it if you want. I don't want to talk over you.
Oh no, please. I want you to give a take. How about that?
Also, Alex's character is a monk with a troubled past who has now turned completely around in his life and is trying to live a very very spiritual life. But because of this, his character is very at times otherworldly, and that means the smallest thing from not understanding what chairs are or how they work to something as vast as it doesn't matter if those villagers die because the greater good will be upheld. So you have these three completely different characters wanting to approach a situation completely differently. And the reason we're all working together is because we all know that there are big threats in the world that will basically destroy everything. And we're like the only ones who know this officially, and we're trying to go around and disrupt the enemy's plans. So
much fun.
It's a lot of fun. It's really. I'll post a link below if anybody wants to read. I keep kind of a story journal of how it goes, but the interaction there is what makes it. I mean, you have my character who's very serious and very much like we must fight with honor and blah blah blah. And then you have like Mike's character's like, why don't I just sneak into their base, stab them all while they're asleep, and get the information we need? Like this is irrelevant. Why would we waste our time? And then you have Alex's character who's very much like
the cosmos.
Yeah, the cosmic balance must be maintained, while still kicking a lot of butt as a monk.
That's so fair.
Yeah. Anyway, I think we're probably coming up to maybe the end of some of the material. What do you think, Alex?
There's not too much more there's not too much more I could say to the point of trying to convince people to at least give it a shot. It doesn't matter the kind of person you are. I would highly recommend it. For those of you, treat it like a pottery class. Treat it like jujitsu. Treat it like a first time anything. Take a look online. See if there's any communities. I would try my best not to do any buy-ins before you really know how you like it. So I would sort of speak against going into a games workshop or game shop and being convinced to buy $120 worth of books before you do it. So sort of walk in there, see what kind of communities are happening in your area, and comment, and you would be, ladies and gentlemen, you would be, how would I put this? You'd be flabbergasted to see how nice people are to new initiates into the Dungeons and Dragons world, into the tabletop fantasy world. It's so much fun to play with a new person because it's like new and fresh. It's like watching your kid play the video games that you used to play when you were a kid. Everything sort of gets re-experienced and everyone shares in that newness and that joy. So yeah, go ahead and start rolling some dice because I'm sure you guys will have a blast.
Yeah, that would be my advice as well. I mean, I'm gonna post some links down below, which will
In the show notes.
possibly help you on your way. There's some people, there's some groups online that basically put their Dungeons and Dragons game on convention, so you can watch it. It's really entertaining. Get you an idea what it's like. But yeah, if you're interested at all, go for it. If you're not, obviously that's great. But it's an excellent and very unique kind of experience. Every time you play is completely different from every other time you play. Even if you're playing in the same story with the same characters with the same people, it's always new and fresh and interesting. So anyway, thanks for listening. I don't know what next month's podcast is going to be.
It'll be a mystery. We'll keep it a mystery, ladies and gentlemen. What could
exactly.
it be?
You'll have to succeed on your knowledge check to find out. So anyway, I've been Dallas,
and this is Alex,
and thanks for joining us.
We're signing off. Have a great afternoon or evening or morning. Goodbye.